And it is my role to introduce our speaker for LTSIG Fridays session today, Elen Le Foll. Well, Ellen is a research associate and English education lecturer at Osnabrück University in Germany, with over 10 years experience as a French and English teacher in adult education. She has now been teaching in the university's teacher training program since 2016. She teaches English pedagogy to future teachers for primary, secondary, and vocational schools. She's currently in the final year of her PhD, exploring the language of school EFL textbooks. Her primary research interests are applications of corpus linguistics in language education materials development and evaluation learners' phraseology and language learners' use of online resources. She has recently co-developed an online introduction to cognitive science course for Ain Shams University in Cairo. So she's going to talk about fostering social learning in times of social distancing. Welcome, Ellen.
So I'm going to switch off my camera in the hope that it makes it easier to hear me. I'm assuming that somebody's keeping an eye on the chat because I can't do that and also present, but I'm really looking forward to your questions or your ideas and sharing knowledge and expertise. So please do make use of the chat to comment, to add things that would be most welcome. It's already been a lot said about me, but perhaps what I'd like to add is that my interest in social learning online and collaborative learning online started when I began to co-design this course for Cairo, for the University of Ain Shams. And really because as a teacher and lecturer, I strongly believe in social learning and collaborative learning methods as part of my way of teaching. I think it's a very effective way to teach and foremost for learners to learn. And so I wanted to be able to bring that to the online setting. So I think that's the way I work in general, working in an online setting, really trying to take what works in the offline classroom and trying to use that online. So I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Many things that we already do offline will work online, but we need to find a way to achieve that. So today I will go through a few definitions, and I will try and focus on the why of social learning. And this is particularly true right now, of course, but I think in general, it's something that we need to think about when we teach online or in blended settings, that the social, the collaborative elements are really important for effective learning to take place. And so I'll be presenting results from lots of different studies in the form of meta-analysis so that we can see what kind of effects collaborative learning can have in online and blended learning settings. So we'll look at the effect of collaborative learning and social learning on knowledge gain, on skill gain, on attitudes and motivations of learners. But we'll also think about some of the limitations that go hand in hand with trying to apply collaborative learning in an online setting. Of course, it's not easy, but there are so many tools and so many existing amazing web-based software that we can use or that we can adapt to our needs. But this requires knowledge about the tools and also the application of strategies that can really foster that social learning. So that's the plan. As for the terminology, I'll try and keep this very, very brief. In the title, I refer to social learning. I will also refer to collaborative learning, but I have no intention to go into the details as to how some researchers apply one term or the other. So as far as I'm concerned for today, we're dealing with social collaborative learning in the sense that it's a learning situation in which two or more students learn together to achieve a common goal or to solve a task, and that mostly through peer-directed interactions. So the elements that are really important here is that knowledge is co-constructed through social interaction, and we have active learners. The teachers are facilitators, but that role is a very important one that we will definitely continue to discuss. So this is a definition. I mean, you can see the one I picked is from 1999. It's definitely pre-online learning, but it's very much true for online settings as well. At least that's what I would argue, that we need to make what works in the offline classroom work online too. So this is a model of collaborative learning that was developed for the classroom setting originally, but which I think can be applied to online learning. So what's important for collaborative learning to be successful? Well, the students need to experience a kind of positive interdependence. So that means they need to feel connected to each other, and they need to have the feeling that they cannot succeed if the others don't succeed. So we have this group goal. Individual accountability is also relevant, and there have been studies that have shown that when that's not the case, there can be issues in group work. So that means that the performance of each individual has to be visible to the rest of the group, and that way every student is genuinely an active member of the learning community. Collaborative learning requires, according to Johnson & Johnson, face-to-face promotive interaction. And this can be a challenge, obviously. But I think in online settings, this is now achievable with video conferencing, where the bandwidth is good enough. But also it's possible to encourage that in other forms. What's essential is that the group members can help each other, can assist each other, and have direct contact in whatever form. Then another important aspect are the social and interpersonal skills of the students, of the learners themselves. This means that in order for collaborative learning to be successful, students need to develop skills like leadership, decision-making skills, trust building, and conflict management skills. These aren't necessarily given. And so these are skills that we need to foster and encourage the development of in our learning settings and when we're teaching. And I think this is quite hard to achieve online only. So this is where it can be helpful to have blended learning settings. It's difficult, I find so far, to do with students that you've never met before in person, and everything is happening online. So I think that's a challenge, something I'd really like to discuss with you at the end, perhaps. And then the final aspect in this model is group processing. That means that the group members in a learning setting have the opportunity to discuss, to assess the actions that they need to go for in order to be successful. And again, we'll see how that's achievable in an online setting. What we mean by online settings, often studies have looked at computer-supported collaborative learning. So sometimes that isn't necessarily online, that can be in the classroom, but using technologies. What these technologies can help us with is they can actually facilitate the group learning processes and facilitate knowledge sharing, the co-construction of knowledge and skills. And there is also some evidence that the use of technologies in such learning situations can help motivation and foster positive attitudes. So what we're looking at is, when we think of computer-supported collaborative learning, is sometimes classroom-based, as I said, sometimes blended learning, so a mixture of online and in the classroom, and then obviously online distance education. And that can be both synchronous and asynchronous, or a mixture, of course. And I'll be trying to focus more on the online settings. I'll be showing the results of some meta-analysis. That's the last piece of terminology I'd like to present before we look at some of those results. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with what a meta-analysis is, but perhaps we have some students who are listening. So we're looking here at a research method that enables us to combine the results of lots of different empirical studies that try and study the same research question. So it's a very helpful way of trying to generalize findings. It's all very well to say a finding, there's been a great intervention, a great method for collaborative learning online, but it's perhaps restricted to one setting, one classroom with one teacher. Is it also the case in a different setting, different subject? And this is the kind of thing that we can try and tease out using meta-analysis. What we're going to look at is to start off with the effect of collaborative or social learning, to start off with in traditional offline settings. Why? Because I think the two settings are not that different. And what works offline will likely work online. The question is how. And I won't go into details of any specific studies, but really collaborative learning is effective. That's been shown more or less across the board. Lots of different studies and lots of different, these are meta-analyses, so collections of dozens, hundreds of studies, and on the whole, we find largely positive effects. There are, however, subtle differences. So for instance, there was a study a while back now in 2008 by Tan and colleagues, and this was a meta-analysis of the effects of cooperative learning versus a traditional, more competitive approach. And these were studies conducted in Southeast Asia. And the results were actually such that cooperative learning was not any more or less effective than a traditional approach. So it wasn't less effective either, but it wasn't more effective. The effects were not as positive as we would expect compared to all other studies that had been conducted so far. And the researchers attribute these results to cultural differences. Now, I've put a big question mark there. Is that true? Has that changed perhaps since? This is more than 10 years ago. But still, I think it's something worth thinking about. If our students are not used to collaborative learning, then it is something that needs to be learned. And that's why I've also went for the word fostering in the title of this talk. I think it's important that as teachers, we're there to facilitate that. And it won't happen by itself first time around. But still something to consider. So the background of our students and their previous experiences with collaboratives and social learning. But there have been, as I said, lots of studies since, including Hattie's meta-analysis of meta-analysis that have shown, again, that cooperative learning is often superior to individualistic learning. And here we have effect sizes that Hattie would consider to be mid-size. And when we speak of social learning or collaborative learning, we mean different interactions that happen. There's always in the classroom the learner-content interaction, the learner-teacher interaction, but here the focus is going to be more and more on this learner-learner interaction. That said, in collaborative learning settings, all three are still valid and important interactions that will continue to happen and that we need to consider at all times. So what I'd like to now present are the results of a large and recent meta-analysis on the effects of collaborative learning in computer-supported learning settings. I'll go through some of the key results fairly briefly, because I'd then like to move on to the how and most importantly to the discussion, which I'm most looking forward to. But this is an analysis that's worth looking at for a number of reasons. First, it's a large meta-analysis. It compares 425 empirical studies. There's no way that as practicing teachers we can read 425 studies and compare the results. This is why I think a meta-analysis is very helpful. These are recent studies, which in the case of online learning, I think is crucial. Things have evolved and are still evolving extremely rapidly. There are new tools. What was true 10 years ago is probably no longer true. The learners have changed as well, of course. Our learners are far more used to working online. They have more access to the devices that you need, and so on and so forth. So that's really important. And another reason why I've picked this particular analysis is because they cover studies across a range of learner ages, educational backgrounds, subjects. And again, I think that's very positive because, as you're probably aware, so many studies are done in higher education, and we have often a lack of studies in other instructional settings. I could give the main result straight away and say that the effects of collaborative learning are mostly positive, but there are some contradictory findings, and so those are also worth having a look at. The studies that were included are all empirical studies, otherwise it's not possible to conduct the meta-analysis. That means they were controlled experimental or quasi-experimental designs with independent control groups. So you're really looking at a comparison, what works more or less, what is more or less effective than another kind of intervention. And in this case, the studies that I'll present, the results that I'll present, are a comparison between learning online or with the use of computers in a collaborative learning setting, or learning online but individually. So it's all online or using computers, using technologies, but not necessarily the comparison is between the collaborative element or the individual learning. The trouble is with measuring learning effects, it's really hard. What are you going to measure? And again, I like this meta-analysis because it splits things up in a way that I think is quite meaningful. What they do is they try and work out what learning, whether the learning goals have been achieved by looking at 3 types of learning goals. The cognitive goals, there's a cognitive processes, learning knowledge, acquiring new skills. This is usually fairly easy to measure with objective tests of skills improvement or knowledge gain, sort of classic tests that we can have in language teaching. But they also look at motivational and affective learning goals. So how students' attitudes towards the subject change through some kind of collaborative learning task. Have their beliefs changed? Do they believe that they can learn better, that they can become more proficient users of English, for instance, using these methods? And then a final learning goal type that they're looking at are social goals. So do students interact with each other in a more efficient way? Do they work better together? Again, these are quite difficult goals to measure, but there have been a number of frameworks that have been elaborated that attempt to tease out these effects and to try and find out whether such interventions are successful. So we have on the one hand learning goals that are fairly easy to measure with kind of objective tests, and then we have other learning goals that need to be looked at with subjective surveys of some kind. And whilst they are subjective, I would argue that they are very important. We do need to find out whether students are able to work in these kinds of settings, if that's something that they enjoy doing, that they feel they can get better at. So these are some of the outcomes of the 425 or so studies that were included in the meta-analysis. And the question that they looked at, as I said, is looking at the effects of collaborative learning versus non-collaborative learning in computer-supported settings. So it's always that comparison. Everything is happening in a computer-supported setting, but comparing collaborative learning with individual learning. And what we find is that knowledge gain is substantially higher on average when students are working in these collaborative learning settings. The G there is the effect size that you can see, so it's a measure of how much one group differs from another, and here the one group is individual learning and the other group collaborative learning. So we have, again, what Hattie would describe as a mid-sized effect. If you look at the individual effect size, you do find a range. So there are a few studies that have even a negative effect size there. So these are interventions where collaborative learning was less successful than individual learning. So we do have some variation, but we also have many studies that have very, very much higher effect sizes. What researchers have found is that collaboration can really help stimulate interpretation and sense-making processes. And these, of course, foster knowledge acquisition. But what's even more impressive is that collaborative learning can really improve skills acquisition. And I think in language learning settings, that's something that we should be very interested in. So here we have an effect size of 0.64, which is really quite high. All of the individual studies had either no effect, I would argue that minus 0.3 is a null effect, to very, very high effects, 2.56 for instance. And what kind of skills can be developed? Well, some of the things that have been looked at are things like critical thinking or logical reasoning, argumentative skills, many others, of course. And the studies that are included here are not only language learning, but I think that there is a lot we can learn as language teachers or as course designers for language courses from these studies, because a lot of what we teach is exactly that, skills acquisition. And the final aspect that was looked at in the meta-analysis is the perception. So these more effective, motivational aspects of learning. And here the effect size is actually smaller perhaps than we would expect. 0.38 is positive, but it's not as impressive as knowledge gain or skills acquisition. Still, collaborative learning can improve students' motivation and attitudes towards a subject matter. So that's another potential benefit of using these kinds of methods. What's great about good meta-analysis is that they enable researchers to conduct moderator analysis. And what that means is, where we have a range of results, for example, here we have individual effect sizes from minus 0.25 to 1.73. So we have an average of 0.38, but we have a whole range in there. And what the moderator analysis tries to do is to try and tease out why there are these differences between the various studies. And that's not something you can do with just the one study. You need to have quite a few for this to be possible. And what Chen and colleagues found in their analysis is that educational level doesn't seem to have an impact, so it's a non-significant effect on effect sizes, on learning, the learning outcomes in collaborative learning settings. So what that means is that collaborative learning is effective for secondary school pupils, in higher education, in adult education. It seems to be just as effective across the board. And I think that's an important finding, because so many studies are based on higher education students, and sometimes it's hard to know whether that can be generalized. But according to this analysis, it looks like it can. So I think that is good news. Similarly, many studies on STEM subjects. It's really hard to find anything on humanities. There are some studies on collaborative learning in English, especially English for academic purposes. But again, this meta-analysis showed that subject area has no significant effect on the effect of collaborative learning. So collaborative learning seems to be effective across the board for a range of subjects. Again, I would say that's positive. Then where we do find a significant effect is duration of the intervention. And that's something that we do need to think about, because the result is maybe counterintuitive. It seems to be that shorter interventions lasting less than a semester have the largest effect sizes, and longer interventions are less effective. So collaborative learning is highly effective, but maybe not for long periods of time. And that's something to think about, especially now, as we don't know how long we'll be teaching online for, but maybe for quite a while longer. So we need to think about what that means for us in practice. Sample size also had a significant effect, but this is something we would expect that we find in most meta-analysis. And there's another effect that didn't reach statistical significance, but which I think we should also consider. And it would appear that learning efficiency for in collaborative settings is higher for high complexity tasks than for low complexity tasks. So if a task is simple, we might be better off dealing with it individually. Where a task is more complex, this is where we can really benefit from working with others, interacting with our peers. So when we do try and plan collaborative tasks for our learners, we really need to think about the complexity of the task and whether that is a task that's suitable for collaborative learning or maybe not. But I guess the crucial question to ask now is the how. So what are effective strategies, and what kind of tools can we use? As I said, there are many already available, and I'm a strong believer that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The meta-analysis that Chen and colleagues conducted actually also looked at the kinds of tools and strategies that can help make collaborative learning in online settings even more effective. And I won't go into the details of the numbers, but you can see that the effect sizes, those are the Gs, the effect sizes are positive across the board. So basically, whatever additional tool or additional strategy you choose to use to boost collaborative learning in online settings is going to work. The question is, which ones work even more effectively, and which ones are also applicable to your context, which ones are doable with the tools that you have available. So they all have, as I said, a positive effect on learning. We find that this one, the category group awareness tool, has particularly high effect sizes. So I'd like to have a look at what's meant by group awareness tools. The idea is simply to have whatever online platform you use for your online learning, having these tools enable students to have some kind of awareness of who's in the group. So informal awareness to start off with, that's simply who's online, who's up for speaking, interacting, communicating, what do my partners look like? Then it's awareness of what the group members are actually doing. And it's also cognitive group awareness, which is more complex. So do my partners agree with me? And how much information do they already have? And then the social group awareness, that's the idea that we know how much our partners are contributing, we know how cooperative they might be, how productive they are, and we know how they perceive our own contributions. So, and giving students the means of being aware of their peers in a learning group situation will boost the learning outcomes in a collaborative setting. Another tool or strategy that was helpful is scripting. There are lots of studies on scripting in online collaborative learning settings. It's the idea of using prompts to facilitate the peer-to-peer interaction. This, I think, can be very helpful in learning, in language learning settings. So the idea is that either students have sort of ready-made chunks in chat boxes, for instance, so they can then complete these chunks, add to them, redistribute them as they see fit. But it's something that helps them to structure their interactions with their peers. These are examples of script prompts that were used in a study. And in this study, it was found that both the transactive memory script prompts, those are on the left in blue, and the transactive discussion scripts on the right in red were helpful and helped students to collaborate more successfully. What was interesting in this particular study, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the researchers, I'll have to look it up, Nozuri and colleagues. This is a study from 2012. And they also had one learning group where the students obtained both kinds of prompts. And this is interesting because what happened then is actually they reached a situation of over-scripting. And so too many prompts actually hindered the collaborative work with the students. So we need to be careful not to script too much, and we need to be very aware of who our students are and what stage they're at, but this can help them, and it can help to structure their interactions. Effective strategies, none of this is going to surprise you because it's very much the same as in the offline classroom. So having and facilitating peer feedback, that can be in the form of assessment, of monitoring, of reviewing, but the idea that learners can give and receive feedback to each other, that is a strategy that works very well to boost collaborative learning success. The role of the instructor, of the teacher, is crucial. So we're here to guide the collaboration process. That may mean a range of things in the context of your particular context, but it could be explaining, modeling, initiating collaboration, and also giving feedback. But it's been shown that any kind of strategy where the instructor is a facilitator of the collaboration process, again, will boost learning success. And then it's important, just like in the offline classroom, to ensure that each member of a learning group has a specific functional role, and that role has some responsibility, that everyone is aware of the role. And again, there are many tools that we can use online to ensure that that's something that's really transparent. So onto the how, practically, with what kind of tools can we achieve this? Well, I know, of course, that many of these things have already been discussed in the Friday webinars, so some of this will definitely not be new. Things like, obviously, video conferencing software, like Zoom, for instance, but also social media. So there have been studies looking at Facebook or WhatsApp, and how those kind of tools can help students work together and collaborate more successfully. Then I would like to mention learning management systems. Of course, this is harder work. It depends on the setting that you're in, but platforms like Moodle or Ilias offer a whole range of tools and plugins that will really facilitate that kind of exchange with the students. If that's not available, then of course we can use file synchronization services to a certain extent and adapt those to our needs. So these are things like Google Doc that can already help us to do quite a lot, for instance, collaborative writing tasks. And most of these, or quite a few of these tools, are commercial tools, so we may have issues in terms of having access, or we may not wish to essentially force our students to create a Google account to use Google Doc, or to install Zoom to take part in a webinar or in a group work which requires video conferencing. which is why I'd like to finish off by presenting some open source solutions, some alternatives to some of these well-known tools. So for video conferencing, obviously Zoom is great, Skype works fine. Some of you may be aware of Big Blue Button, which is entirely open source. We use it at Osnabrück University, and I have to say it's great for collaborative work. So there are also breakout rooms, the possibility to do live polls, and there's a common notepad, chat function, everything you need really. And this doesn't require students to install questionable software. Then there are, another solution would be Jitsi, and that's easier to work with in the sense that jitsi.org has this Jitsi Meet option, which is a free hosting of Jitsi. I've worked with that for small group activities. That works very well. Again, no account is necessary, so it's very easy to access for students. I don't know, perhaps we can discuss this, how well it works with larger groups. But certainly for small group work, this is very successful. And Jitsi also has integration of collaborative writing, so that's very useful. For project work, I'd say sort of as an alternative to Slack or Teams, there are lots of options out there. There seem to be new options popping up every day. But certainly Discord, for instance, is very helpful, can help us to work in projects. So very similar to Slack with channels, but it also allows for video and audio conferencing in small groups. So this is really ideal for collaborative work among students. And there are, of course, secure chat messaging apps, and also things like Hune, which enables also file sharing and wiki functions, so students working collaboratively on a text as well. And as a very cheap and simple alternative to Google Doc, the Etherpad works very well. And there's one that's currently available entirely for free, hosted for free, pad.education, which is very simple. I mean, this is the kind of tool that doesn't have fancy buttons or lots of fancy options, but works very well. And I think some of these simple methods are often the best. There are many, many more to explore, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are lots of alternative tools that we can use beyond some of the big commercial solutions. So that's what I wanted to show. Take-home messages. The simplest and easiest message would simply be to say that collaborative learning in online learning settings is effective. And if it's effective, then we need to do our best to make sure it happens. And there are so many tools out there to make it happen that I think there are no excuses. Prior experience with collaborative learning is a factor. So we do need to be aware of that it may be necessary to train learners, both technically, as in what skills do you need, and also in terms of the soft skills, like I said, sort of conflict management and these sorts of things. It is a factor, so we do need to be aware of that. I think avenues to explore are things like the collaboration activities that we can set our students. Again, these are very similar to the ones we would probably set in an offline setting. Supporting the collaboration with discussion forums, with breakout rooms, with additional project work tools. We can use additional tools to ensure that there is group awareness, for instance, that we really support the learning. And strategies like facilitating the learning through the teacher, modeling through teacher interactions. There are so many tools out there that occasionally just seems there are so many, it's difficult to get a good overview. I would always pick the ones that are simple, and simple is often not fancy, but it works. It's obviously, I'm sure you found this too, easier if there's no registration. Those are the kinds of things that slow down learning processes. And we need to be aware that we might need to train our students and our learners to work effectively in collaborative learning settings. But I would argue that that's time well invested. So that's it for me right now. I'm looking forward to hearing what kind of settings you're currently teaching in, whether you've already started working with social and collaborative learning activities, what kind of tools you've used, and how your students have responded, the kind of challenges that you faced. Those are some of the things I'm very curious to find out about.
Thank you very, very much, Ellen. Should we come on webcam? Your voice seems very stable at the moment. And
Let's try.
absolutely impressive. And Raquel, do you want to come in?
Yes. Thank you, Ellen, for your presentation. Very interesting. And I kept an eye in the chat and I realized there are some comments and I'm going to read some of them and the questions, okay? So at first, there was a question by Gary saying that in a so-called collectivist society, isn't it interesting that collaborative practice in terms of maybe people...
Sorry, Raquel, can you repeat the last two sentences? Because I accidentally muted you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Right. So Gary asked a question in the chat. In a so-called collectivist society, isn't it interesting that collaborative practices are not that effective? And there were some comments following that in terms of online courses leading to positive student performance outcomes, the fact that people are competitive, and would you answer? Is it clear to understand?
I'm having a quick look in the questions as well. Yeah, I think you're referring to the Cannes study from 2008, and I think that's a very interesting one. I'm not entirely sure I agree with the conclusions of the authors, to be honest. It's a short paper. I'm having a quick referring to the Cannes. Essentially, that's the conclusion. Yeah, I think you're referring to what kind of interventions really happened, and as I mentioned, whether it's still the case, because tools have moved on and our learners have moved on, and I'm pretty certain that's the case in Southeast Asia as much as anywhere else. Our students are much more used to working with video conferencing, with discussion forums. As to the societies we live in, yes, there is a lot of competitive learning out there, and it's something that's often fostered as well with different names. I mean, we call it sometimes game-based learning, and that's often also very competitive. I would argue that we need to ensure that our students are able to thrive in all of these environments. So yes, we can still have some game-based learning that has a competitive element, but we also need to be able, I would argue, to have other learning scenarios where it's the collaborative learning that comes to the foreground, and that is to be fostered. We need to have the kind of atmosphere that will enable that to have those 5 or 6 elements I mentioned, if you remember in the diagram with those various circles. So if we have accountability, if we have teacher support, if we have the possibility for the group to be aware of how it works together, if the group is able to interact properly, if all of these elements are there, I think it will work. And my experience is that it definitely does work. So I think it's possible to have all kinds of settings.
I see. There's another question What was the number of students that these effects size were based on?
Ah, that's a good question. Can I find the number immediately? We shall see how quick I can be. So we looked at something like 400 individual studies in that meta-analysis. Number of students, I didn't write it down. It is definitely in the paper. Essentially, you're looking at something like on average 20, 25 students per group. So often you have at least one control group and one intervention group. So you're looking at something like on average 60 students per study, and we've got over 400 studies. So it's a lot of students, that's for sure.
Very well. Next question. Were the studies mainly of maths or science rather than language learning? So what ages were the students and in which countries mainly? I think the question has very different aspects here.
About the countries, I'm not entirely certain, to be honest. I would have to check again. I can definitely have a look. Age is quite a range. That's why I also thought that this particular meta-analysis was very interesting, because it includes, in fact, even upper primary school, right up to adult education. And I think that's an important one. I mean, I teach in teacher training, mostly primary, secondary, and vocational schools. And it's frustrating when we look at studies and it's all higher education students. So this, this meta-analysis that I presented really looks at results from across the range.
The next one is mostly a comment. Online collaboration provides real-time communication between students, but it lacks the aspect of face-to-face interaction. Would you comment on that?
Yes, that's true. It's absolutely true. We can obviously use video conferencing if the students have access to that technology and have the necessary broadband. We can also, I think small things can help. So for instance, in one of the online seminars that I'm teaching this term, which wasn't planned as an online seminar, the circumstances have been such. One of the things that I did is asked all the students to upload a photo of themselves. Obviously, it was optional, but actually everyone did it. And it's really helpful, just we have a name and we have some face. We have something to attach that to. And then I asked everyone to introduce themselves and gave, in a kind of scripted sense, like as I presented, a few ideas. And then I modeled that by introducing myself with these 4 or 5 points. And some of them were unnecessary, you could say. They weren't related to the course. You know, what's my favorite, this and that. But this can be very helpful because we have some kind of personal connection that's not the same as meeting the person face to face, but it's better than just the name and some a link or something.
The next one is, students cannot argue with one another simultaneously over the online platform because of longer lag times. So if them in collaborative learning, considering this context, what do you have to say?
It's something that needs to be learned. All interactions, I would say, have to be learned. So it's the same in the offline classroom. The first time you give pair work or group work, it will probably go pear-shaped. And again, it needs to be practiced online too. Different modes of interactions can be practiced, can be facilitated and modeled by the teachers.
And the last question so far, what is the reference for the study?
All the references are going to be in the slides. I mean, they are in the slides, so I can definitely keep those as a PDF, and it's going to be uploaded on the website.
Exactly.
Yes, that's probably easiest.
Great. Thank you.
All the details. Yeah. Yeah, I can see also comments on Big Blue Button. Yes, it depends on where it's hosted. So Big Blue Button needs to be hosted, and if your host is not does not have the capacity to have large meetings, then it won't work, of course, or not very well. At Osnabrück University, we're very lucky that we have a very good IT department that's worked very hard recently, because obviously everyone is doing everything online. But it's actually now working very well, I have to say. We hardly have any problems. So very happy with the system. And I think it works very well. It's really suited for education. That's what makes it great. Other tools have to be adapted and can be adapted. This one was designed for that.
There's an older question. How many of OC were synchronous and how many were asynchronous?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. And in fact, that division wasn't made by the researchers quite as clearly, because many were a mixture. So that's the thing. That's why it wasn't included in the moderator analysis, because it wasn't that clear cut. But obviously it's a very valid question, because it will change the collaboration, no doubt.
Sure. OC meaning online collaborations. Well, I think the questions, it seems the questions are over. If you have any other questions and you'd like to type. And this
can I ask Ellen, perhaps?
Ellen. Sure, I can.
Sure.
Ellen, would you have a question to the audience? I'm not sure whether you're seeing the chat, but would you also have a question to the audience?
Yes, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. Obviously, it's a lot there, which is great. It's difficult to look at. My question really is the one that I mentioned at the end. Have you tried collaborative learning? What have been some of the challenges that you've had? I mean, I can see in the chat that there have been challenges with various tools, but what about the learner reactions? That's what I would be interested in, especially in various contexts. So I know what my university students have reacted like, but I'd be curious to find out, what the reactions are in different settings.
The mics are open to be unmuted. If you like to take the mic for comments, feel free.
There are two comments in the chat here. So Vicky mentioned, when you can build the sense of community, collaborative learning happens more easily. Gary adds that it takes time, as you say, to get collaborative learning work. And he also mentions that people do need the training.
Yes, and that's exactly what the meta-analysis showed as well, right? That it is something that needs to be acquired, and then perhaps we have different cultural settings, different experiences, and also different access to the tools and to the methods. I mean, I have some of my students whose broadband is also not good enough to have video conferencing, have similar issues to me. We live in Germany, but you would be surprised. We're not very well connected in many areas, and that's problematic, right? So in some group work, 3 have the videos on and 1 cannot, and immediately that's an imbalance in the group setting.
I would like to share my experience, and maybe because I read in the comments some people saying that when you don't know your students face to face, this is more difficult to achieve. And for a few years, I had the lovely experience of teaching a course at the University of La Sabana in Colombia, fully online, because I live in Argentina. And so I, of course, didn't know my students face to face. And so it took a while to build, as I said, this sense of community and getting to know each other and trust each other. And then all the collaborative learning activities that were proposed were much more successful when everything felt there was a safe atmosphere to be working together and to be sharing their experiences.
Yes, I agree, and often actually fostering that atmosphere is is not that difficult. It can be very little things that can make it really really fun. This morning I have a class that starts at 8:30 on Fridays. It's not the best of time to start, and I decided to just have a blank slide to start off with, and told everyone they could use in Big Blue Button you can have a whiteboard function, and everyone could draw their mood. And it was great fun. We had a good laugh. It was a good start. There were lots of Zs because people were tired and people needing coffee and things like that. But you have a positive start to the lesson, and everyone feels that they're really part of that learning community. Everyone's a little bit tired, everyone's a little bit hungry, but we're all up for a fun session. So little things like that can really make that group environment positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Thanks everyone for attending the session, and it will be available in LTSIG YouTube channel shortly. Stay tuned for our social media channels, because we are going to share as we have the recording and the material as well in the blog. Thank you very much for taking part, and keep sharing the events we have for LTSIG Fridays. As for next Friday, the webinar number 8 is with Joe Gakonga, Teaching Grammar Online, and I'll be sharing more information on that in the social media, but this is already available in our blog.
Great, thank you.